Sadie Jones, welcome to the Great Big Book Club. Very lovely to see you.
Thank you.
I'm excited to be hearing about your brilliant new novel called The Snakes, which is just brilliant. Anyway, shall we have a little read first before we talk about it?
Sure. This is just a short section from about halfway through. It's a book about a young couple who are traveling in France, and she comes from a hugely wealthy family, and he comes really from poverty, really, but he is not quite aware of how much money her family have, and it's beginning to dawn on him in this section. They're in a remote hotel in France that's kind of falling down, belonging to her brother. £150,000. £150,000 a year. In the middle of the night, Dan lay in bed and watched Bea sleeping and hated her. 150,000. Her rounded cheek was resting on her open hand. She looked about 12 years old, innocent. This didn't need to have happened. This wasn't where they had to be. He thought of their rain-soaked, stupid honeymoon in Yorkshire, his 2 cheap M&S suits, the slip-on shoes he hated. He thought of the smell of their old clothes drying by the radiators and the twisting in his stomach every time Bea sat down to do the sums for the month. He thought of how she pretended to worry about paying each bill and made him feel guilty for every takeaway coffee, and he felt sick with himself for going along with her lie. For 3 years, he had hardly let himself think of it. Her money, like coins that stacked and heaped and shuffled in an arcade coin pusher, but never fell. Bea had the key. She could open up the back of the machine at any time. They could be holding fistfuls of gold, and she knew it, but she kept pretending, fixing broken soles onto her shoes and telling him how lucky she felt. Lucky. He had thrown away his dreams to spend his days showing strangers round stinking flats vacated by the corpses of threadbare old men, hoping for his reduced, only fair, non-exploitative 1% commission to drag them into the next month and the next mortgage payment, never having any choices, never doing anything they wanted with the one precious life they had. Because of her. Because of her, his future was in cold storage and had dried up and gone. She talked about believing in him, but all the time she held him back.
Oh, that's juicy. So you need to tell me a bit about explain the story about how Bea is a daughter of an extremely rich man and who has rejected the world. She's kind of she's sort of the original Trustafarian, isn't she?
She is, and she's, it's difficult to, he's really the counterpoint to her. She's just turned away from the money for a lot of reasons. There's a profoundly dysfunctional family, and she's seen firsthand what tremendous wealth will do to people, and she doesn't want any part of it. And so she has, she is a social worker. Or she works for the NHS as a psychotherapist, rather. And she lives this very, what she considers a very lucky life, because they're property owners in London, her and her husband, who's a estate agent, but he wants to be an artist. So she's thinking, we're great, we're in the 1%, we've got a flat and we're in London and everything's wonderful. But when he discovers that, her family have 4 houses and her dad used to have a private jet and he can't, like most of us wouldn't be able to, really can't see what the problem would be with just having, just £1 million, just have £1 million, and then you're kind of set, but you're not crazy rich. You could just, you'd have a house. So that's the debate within their marriage. But then there's a much larger story going on, because they go to stay with her brother, who's a sort of ex-addict, trying to be ex-addict, and the parents come out. There's a terrible tragedy, and so it's also a book about grief and families and pain and all those things. And because it was such a intense dark book to write about, grief and pain. It really needed to be a thriller because there's nothing, it can sound dreary, basically, a book that is so dark. But there's nothing about grief that's dreary or slow. Grief is kind of a cliffhanger. So I wanted to write a book that had this kind of vertiginous, scary feeling where you just don't know what's going to happen all the time. And so the whole book is this, it's kind of a knife edge.
And you bring in sort of layer upon layer and character upon character, and you've got, the parents, the father, who is sort of a sort of trumpet type character, and his hollow sort of, she's stiletto thin, isn't she?
Yes.
Wife. That is one of those great sort of money matches, isn't it? The trophy and the beast.
She's she's surprisingly he's still on his first wife, but they're the sort of, he's very aggressive, overtly vile, really. He's kind of charming and obnoxious and grabbing and greedy, and she has this sort of very, she just does yoga all the time, and she's very about the love, but she's absolutely in this bargain with him. I mean, like most marriages, there's a good cop, bad cop thing, but they're both in the partnership. She's at least as damaged, if not more appalling, and completely amoral, really, person.
But there is that sort of bargain that the trophy has with the beast about money, isn't there? Those marriages are often broken and brittle and awful, and you've done that brilliantly in the book.
Thank you. They want these things about one another, and very cleverly don't talk about them. But his greed is material, and her greed is emotional and narcissistic. So he's sort of, got an outward greed, and she's got an inward hunger that is just unfillable, and neither of them can be satisfied by anything, which makes them profoundly destructive.
There is a rather beautiful love letter to France in it, with the crumbling hotel, which is owned by poor old Dan. Do you go to France a lot? Do you love it?
I think, like many of us have, it's so next door. You've had childhood holidays there and driven through it and been there for work and been there for, it's just, we have such a close sort of sibling relationship with France, don't we? I think historically. And she has this sort of rosy view of it. She's bilingual, and it's set in Burgundy, just outside Beaune, and it's really the two sides that outwardly there's this it's quite romantic, and it's very, very beautiful. The hotel that her poor brother is trying to run all on his own, which isn't really, it's just owned by the father, and he's really just in this kind of slavery of just hanging out there, rich slavery. But when it comes to the actual reality of, it's not that the French police, because of this tragedy, there's the police get involved. And because of that, you sort of see under the prettiness, where there's, it's not corrupt and terrible, the situation, but there's a certain, the red tape in France, and the feeling that you may feel France very well, but actually when you get into the reality of it, they're victims of a crime, and they have no idea what's going on, and they have no idea of the procedure, and they're just as foreign as if they were in, Zambia.
But it was, you wrote it during Brexit, didn't you? Or the lead up to Brexit, 2016. So I sort of slightly saw that as a metaphor of, us thinking we're very close, but in fact we are at sea as well.
Yeah, there's that element too. And it was sort of as well kind of a farewell to old Europe thing, because whatever ideas we've had about Europe, it's a place that is in a decline, that is sort of quietly collapsing or sort of imploding. So there was a lot of because we were all examining that relationship at the time, and there was I was writing it in 2016, so there was, Trump was about to be elected and then was elected. Things, it was a pretty grim year, and it seemed like things, I mean, it's funny now, but it seemed it was a huge turning point. And I wrote it with a lot of anger about Brexit, about politics, about greed, about the hyper-rich and hyper-capitalism and all of that stuff. So rather than writing a sort of, I was and am terrified of writing a way we live now novel. I didn't want to do that, and I didn't want to be journalistic, but I wanted to write a book that was a microcosm of all those things, that family is absolutely like this sort of black hole, or sort of quintessence of all of the things that were making me crazy.
But you kind of love a dysfunctional family, because your brilliant book, The Outcast, which was nominated for the Orange Prize and won the Costa best first book. I mean, that was also about a dysfunctional family. There's something for you, I think, something that, I mean, tell me, do you find it the most sort of delicious thing to play with?
I've yet to meet a family that isn't dysfunctional. This family in particular are intensely, I mean, they're appalling. But I have one friend who says that she comes from an entirely happy, healthy family where no one has ever been addicted to anything or killed themselves. And this is cousins and grandparents and everything. And I find that so surprising. And a lot of us come from a happy family, but there are very few you could name that don't have some kind of an issue in some way or another. And I think, like my second book, Small Wars, there was a very happy marriage at the heart of it. When things went wrong with them, they didn't have the tools to manage it. And I think often with happy people, or any people, we can manage when things are okay, but when things go wrong, the toolbox to talk about that, or the way to deal with things, is what's missing. And I think if I'm in love with any element of dysfunction, it's probably that meeting between what we should and need to do to help ourselves and what we are actually able to do.
And how do you come up with your characters? I mean, I spoke to a writer the other day who said they interviewed their characters, which I thought was such a brilliant description of how to sort out a character. So how do you pick them, and do you plot sort of in a very minute way, or is it much more free flowing?
I love that interviewing thing. That's is it sort of Stanislavski, method actors will interview their characters in that way?
It sounds like it, yeah.
And I think that writing is sort of method acting on the page, really. So the way I think of it is that I interview myself. You've got the blank page and the idea, and you're just sitting staring at it, and you have to have some way of getting a dialogue going. So I'll say, okay, well, if this happened, what would he do then? Or if that happened, what would be the possibilities? Just to try and get it back and forth. So it's a similar process. And I think I find plot and story incredibly hard. And plot, what I think of the maths of the story, the structure and storytelling are, I think I have to be incredibly rigorous. But as a reader, I have very little patience for books that don't bother with stories, and literary writers who dismiss story. And I think of all the great and classic novels, there's none that you would not start by saying what it was about and what happened. We talk about Hamlet, or we talk about Crime and Punishment. These are stories. And so what I'm always trying to do is to make a story which is like sweating blood, but for that to come from the truth of character and the truth of what I'm trying to tell, to make that story not feel applied, but to feel that it's grown out of it. And that's kind of what I try to do.
But you have a very shocking ending in this book, which I won't obviously say what it is. But so did you have the ending and then work backwards, or did you have all the arcs done? I mean, it's sort of was it a surprise?
No, I do have the ending. I have the ending with all my books. I've had the ending very early on. Before I have the beginning. Knowing where to start is really, really hard because you get bogged down in all the backstory and how do the people get there and where will I begin, but with the ending, it's the thing that I'm always driving towards, and you can lose sight of it and get lost in the middle. But the ending is always the thing that I know that I'm going towards. And with this ending, I've been kind of surprised how surprised people are by it. And it's difficult to talk about without giving it away, as you said. But to me, it felt an absolutely, I didn't want it to be predictable, but it felt inevitable to me. So it's that's a very difficult balance, because it has, I feel a good ending should feel that there's no other ending that could have happened, and that was always what was going to happen. But it also should feel like you're not quite sure if it will or how it will go. And that's a very difficult balance to strike. And I don't know if I've got that right, or if I ever get that right.
I don't think any of us do. We would just hope that what we've done is all or the best that we could have done at the time.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, your characters are so rounded and brilliant and delicious. Did you fall in love with any particular one as you were writing it, or did you suddenly think, yeah, he's back or she's back when you're writing? You know, sometimes you fall in love with a character and think, I must bring them back now.
It's fun. Yes, there are characters I relate to more. Dan, the husband, is very relatable. He's the sort of, there was a kind of a Beatrix and Dante thing going on, and that he's very human and has all the human failings, and that she's sort of somehow put in that awful female position of being the guiding light of morality and perfection and goodness, which is
she's got a little tattoo on the back of her neck, hasn't she? Yeah.
But there was this, so that was a fun game going between the two of them in that dialogue, and he always sort of stepped up. I knew exactly who he was, and she was. It's difficult to write goodness, and morality is a lot more pompous on the page than in the head. I think most of us try to do the right thing and behave properly all the time, but when you put that down, it can look. It's interesting how differently it tells to how it lives.
And grotesques are always much more fun to write, aren't they? I mean, like, you know, Liv is a brilliant character. I mean, you know, you just know exactly who she is. I think being gentle and kind can be rather dull on page. Do you know what I mean?
It's a really tough one. But there was a character in it who you probably wouldn't even remember. There's the German translator. This German translator, I became completely obsessed by her. She has this kind of quite cheerful relationship in the interviews with Dan at the police station. Loved her. And for days, I was having to like cut her back because I got so involved with her shoes and her accent and how sensible she was. It was, yeah, you do sort of get, when the characters leap forward, it's fun. You must have that. You know, you get into a chat with them.
It's also like being a stage manager, and you feel like saying, no, love, but you need to go back a bit. You two come forward. It's very funny. So you're writing now?
I am writing now. It's really weird, the lockdown writing. It started out like the perfect writer's scenario, and then it's got much more distracting. But I'm just coming up to the bit where there's going to be a lovely downhill gallop to the end of this book I'm writing. But I'm hesitant to do it because I'm going back and sort of making sure it's all earned before I get there, because I don't want to get it wrong, because you can only write that last 50 pages first one time, you know, and I want to be galloping at it and not going, oh, that's not quite right. So I'm poised on the brink of my ending.
It sounds like you're enjoying your lockdown. You're about the only person I've spoken to who is.
It's a very, everyone says this, it's a very strange time. There are tragic things that have happened, and there are difficult things, and my parents are old and trying to look after them, and I feel very sad for my children because they're in their early 20s and being derailed from their plans to come home. But in my selfish little world, I've got my whole family here, and we're all, what's that thing people say about their kids? As soon as they're fit to live with, they leave. And now they're back, and they're so fit to live with. They're great company. And we're having a wonderful time, and they cook and we cook, and we're all doing exercise together. And so in the midst of all this awful difficulty and pain, there's this strange little golden center to it. So it's very, it's very conflicting, knowing exactly how to feel, but we're all very moody about it. Don't you find you're moody about it?
Yeah, everyone's quite cross in my house.
We have had that. We do have
a lot of shouting.
Oh God, I envy shouting. I think we are towards the 1950s. I'm always going, how do you feel to them? Like, fine, everything's fine.
That's very funny. So when is this? What's the next one called then?
At the moment, it's called Echoing Green.
Great. And when's it coming out? Do you think next year?
No idea. I haven't. They're not quite. They're very nice and gentle with me, and they sort of go very occasionally. When do you think you might deliver? And I said, I don't really know. So I'm not sure yet, but certainly not for a year at least.
Amazing. Well, listen, congratulations on the huge success of The Snakes. It's just a delicious, vicious, brilliant book, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.